street. I'm very fortunate that Senator Davis from Beaufort is going to be joining us today. I remember back in 2014, after the CBD bill was first introduced, I was interviewed for an article in the newspaper. And it was a phone interview, and my first interview. And I thought I said all these really intelligent, profound things about CBD oil and the potential benefits for patients in South Carolina and how we needed this product and had to have access to it. And I opened up the paper the next day, and my one quote in the paper was, "Senator Davis is my hero." And that's still pretty much true today. One of the things he did, so obviously we've been fighting for this issue for quite some time, as it takes some time in the state legislature. And one of the things he did in 2016, our bill had passed subcommittee in Senate Medical Affairs and went to full committee. And in that hearing, we basically got hammered. The bill just got completely shot down. And something was a little bit unexpected. And Senator Davis, the very next day in session, said, "You know what? I'm going to start sharing stories of patients on the Senate floor every single day from today until the end of session." That was about 2 months worth of stories, because he knew that there were patients in this state who were going to continue to suffer because his colleagues failed to move that bill forward. And it was something that was very important to him to make sure that they understood how people would be affected by not having access to this medicine. So with that in mind, I'm going to just let Senator Davis come up and talk about his experience in working on this legislation and where he thinks it's going to go from there, and whatever else you want to share.
Thanks. Good afternoon. It's great to be with you guys. Great, Dr. McCarty, for talking about the science of this, and Jill talking about the practical aspects of this. And Jill has already recounted how I got involved in this. I'm a state senator, first of all, from Beaufort County, which is District 46, which is in the very southeastern corner of the state, down there by Savannah, about 2.5 hours away. I know that because I just drove it. And I did get involved in this through Jill's daughter and Jill's mother-in-law being a constituent of mine and telling me about her daughter, Mary Louise, who had intractable epilepsy, and then learning about how CBD oil was something that provided relief to this child with epilepsy who had 100 seizures an hour. If you can imagine, having 100 seizures an hour is what she was suffering. And none of the pharmaceutical drugs that were prescribed to her by physicians provided any relief. And yet CBD oil, or an extract from cannabis, in fact provided relief. In fact, allowed her to get off these drugs that were rendering her pretty much comatose, that weren't taking care of her seizures at all. And as soon as I heard that story, I went ahead and started to draft the bill. And you might think it's a bit unusual for a Republican to be advancing this, but really it isn't, because if you think about at least what I think a Republican is, and how my core governing philosophy is, and I was talking to the professor down here a little bit earlier about that. I'm a believer in individual liberty and sort of the principle of governance that John Stuart Mill talked about, in terms of a legitimate pretext for government acting has to be prevent harm from to others. So in other words, my freedom to swing my arm ends where your nose begins, so that if my behavior affects somebody else or causes harm to somebody else, that's when government can step in and say, no, we're going to stop that behavior because you're causing harm. But except to that extent, I believe government ought not be involved. I mean, if my actions are not going to affect anybody beyond myself, how is that not a Republican principle? How is that not a conservative principle? I mean, we're supposed to be about expanding liberty. We're supposed to be about limited government. And the great irony here is that my primary opposition in the South Carolina General Assembly isn't Democrats. It's Republicans. It's Republicans who ostensibly believe in individual liberty, who's supposed to believe in limited government, but that goes out the window when they're talking about a social issue. And I think it was very telling that the doctor was explaining to us the Controlled Substances Act, which made cannabis a Schedule I drug, was in 1970, which was a direct result of the protests, the Vietnam War protests, and people coming to Washington, D.C., and the prevalence of marijuana smoking. And it was an outgrowth of that. And so we've been laboring under this view that's been imposed on us by this 1970 law, for the past 47 years. And it really makes no sense whatsoever. And I'm sure if you're not as familiar with the politics of this issue as I am, because I've been living it, it probably amazes you to think that here you've got medical research that conclusively demonstrates that cannabis can provide medicinal relief for a number of horrible conditions, and yet it's somehow illegal. I mean, it doesn't add up, does it? I mean, if you've got the National Academy of Sciences, which is the preeminent medical science community in the United States, after 10,000 peer-reviewed studies, concluded earlier this year that cannabis is highly effective in regard to treating those conditions in a way that pharmaceuticals aren't, why in the world are we standing in the way? Why in the world are we preventing doctors from letting patients take something that's going to benefit them? And the answer to that question is, well, it is becoming legal. You've got 29 states now that have legalized it. You've got the District of Columbia that has legalized it. And also you've got at the federal level, you've got Congress has legalized it too, if you want to be honest about it. For the last 3 years, in the congressional budget, there has been a proviso adopted that says of the money that is appropriated and given to the Department of Justice to enforce federal laws, none of that money can be used to enforce the Schedule I Controlled Substances Act prohibition against states that have legalized cannabis for medicinal purposes. So this argument that I hear that we don't want to pass a law that somehow goes against federal law, that doesn't hold water, because for the last 3 years, Congress has made a part of the budget a prohibition against the Department of Justice enforcing that federal law against states that have legalized it. So you do have federal level approval. And as Dr. Narcotti pointed out, the FDA has also created circumstances within which cannabis-related drugs are legal, orphan drugs. You've also had the executive branch, the President, Department of Justice, something called the Cole Memorandum, stating to prosecutors throughout the United States, you are not to enforce this Schedule I prohibition in states that have legalized it for medicinal purposes. So you've got the congressional appropriation proviso, you've got this Cole Memorandum in the executive branch, so you have the federal government saying to states, it's okay, you can move forward with this. And why would that be? Why would you have this push for 29 states to legalize it, and the District of Columbia to legalize it? And why would you have the federal government saying, both in its congressional appropriation and in executive branch actions, that it's okay? Well, the answer is obvious. It's because it provides real relief. It is medicine that has demonstrably provided relief where pharmaceuticals fail. So the question becomes, what is the resistance here in South Carolina? Or to answer your question over here about what can you do to make sure that this law gets passed. And I'll answer that question by giving a little bit of history of how we've gotten where we are right now, and then I'm going to talk very specifically about what some of the obstacles are and how we can get over the hump. When we got CBD oil legalized 3 years ago, that was a bit of a lift because it was still a cannabis-related medicine, and you had a lot of legislators, primarily in the upstate. And South Carolina is, in terms of political demographics, really 3 basic regions. You've got the upstate, which I define as being extending from, say, Anderson, Greenville, Spartanburg, Rock Hill, and an arc in the northern part of the state, which are very socially conservative. I mean, for them, a Republican from that area will be somebody who has very conservative social values, whether it's in regard to abortion or same-sex marriage or prayer in school or any number of issues, including cannabis. And so when this CBD oil bill was introduced, I got a lot of pushback from my colleagues in the Senate who are from the upstate, because they have constituencies that think about cannabis in a certain way. And what a politician wants most of all, remember this, is always to get reelected the next time. And so in order to persuade a politician to support something, you're going to have to persuade that politician that his or her constituents are going to support it. And you've got some ways to do that. First of all, there has been extensive polling done on this in South Carolina. And a Winthrop poll a couple years ago indicated that of Republican primary voters, likely Republican primary voters, 75% agree that cannabis should be available for medicinal purposes under a doctor's supervision. So you can start with that, and it's 80% with Democrats. So you're talking about, on a blended average, about 78% of South Carolinians believe that cannabis ought to be a medicine that doctors can authorize patients to take. So you start with that. You start with the fact that you're dealing with a subject matter that has overwhelming popularity. In fact, I can't think of any other public policy initiative that would enjoy a 78% approval rating across the board in South Carolina among all parties, Republicans, Democrats, Independents, whatever. So, one way when you talk to your legislator is to bring those numbers out. Go online and look up the Winthrop poll. In the Democratic primary a couple years ago, it was put on the ballot as a question of whether, and access that information as well. So start there. The second thing you do is you go to the science. You go to the National Academy of Science. You talk about that 2007 study, the peer-reviewed articles, 10,000 of them. And the overwhelming conclusion that cannabis is highly effective. There's no other category that is higher than that. So you've got the medical community saying that this is something that isn't just anecdotal. It's not just something that you hear stories about. This is something that, as Dr. Narcocardi just pointed out, there is empirical scientific support for. And it makes sense, doesn't it? And if your body, and I've learned a lot about this in the last few years, as you might imagine, in trying to develop arguments to get this passed. But doesn't it stand to reason that if you've got cannabinoids or you've got THC in your body, throughout your body, and you've got these cannabinoid receptors, that a lot of these conditions that you suffer from, whether they're neurological or whether it's cancer or something, that might be somehow caused by imbalances of these cannabinoids in your body? Just from a scientific basis, if I'm made up of and I have in me degrees of THC and CBD, it stands to reason, at least to me, that one thing you might want to look at when there are problems is maybe trying to adjust those cannabinoid levels, trying to do something and figure out what works, and trial and error. And it's not an exact science, what I've learned. It's not an exact science in terms of you can look at somebody's condition and you can say, okay, they need this percent of THC and this percent of CBD. It's more of an art in that respect, in that everybody's body is going to have different levels or different balances of these cannabinoids. And what might work in terms of a combination for one might not work for another. And so what you find, and I've gone to, in Washington, D.C., and I've seen grow facilities, and I've seen dispensaries, and I've tried to educate myself as to the practical aspects of this. And what you find is you have an initial authorization by the physician saying, this patient has this condition and we think that cannabis could be a medicinal benefit, and they give them the authorization, the written authorization, which begins the process. But then what the patient then does is work with the dispensary, and they end up working with different types of cannabis with different ratios of THC to CBD to try to figure out through trial and error what is going to provide the most medicinal benefit. And so, and you do find relief, and that's why you see 29 states, and you've got more states on the way. It's because this works. Now, in terms of where the thing is right now in the General Assembly, it's in the Senate. I dropped a bill last session in the Senate, and there is a parallel bill that was dropped in the House, because as you know, a bill has to be read through a subcommittee, a full committee, and then the entire vote of the body before it crosses over to the other side and goes through that same process again through subcommittee, committee and full committee. So we filed a bill in both chambers simultaneously, because whichever one moves most quickly through the process, that will then become the vehicle that we use to get it passed. And at this point in time, both the House bill and the Senate bill are in subcommittee. And the subcommittee is where testimony is received. The subcommittee is where, 5 or 6, or there's 5 senators that are on this subcommittee, and I'm on it, receives testimony and looks at the bill and then amends it and then passes it to full committee, and then hopefully goes to the Senate floor. So last session in the Senate subcommittee, we had at least 2 full subcommittee hearings. I want to say maybe 3, but at least 2. Well, was it 3? 2. Where we received the first subcommittee hearing testimony from the medical community, which overwhelmingly proved the case that cannabis has medicinal qualities, that cannabis can provide relief for certain conditions that pharmaceuticals can. I don't think even those that are opposing the legalization of cannabis for medicinal purposes are no longer saying it's not medicine. I mean, you used to have them walking around the lobby with little stickers that said, marijuana is not medicine. Those stickers have gone away. Okay, that case has been overwhelmingly made. But the second subcommittee hearing that we held was designed for law enforcement and for the law enforcement community to come forward and to voice what their concerns were in regard to the bill. And that's where the primary opposition to this bill is coming from in South Carolina. We have a law enforcement community led by the SLED chief, the state law enforcement division chief, Mark Keel, who has made preventing cannabis being legalized as a medicine his #1 policy objective in South Carolina. I quite frankly don't understand that, how you can have an issue with 78% of South Carolinians in favor of it, while you have our law enforcement community actively and aggressively lobbying against it. But it's a reality. That's what we have. And law enforcement, deservedly so, are very respected members of the community. Law enforcement, they carry a lot of weight. They have a lot of respect, and they deserve a lot of respect. And so we need to listen to what their concerns are, because as a practical matter, a lot of senators, and I'll speak about senators because that's what I know, in the upstate are going to be reluctant to pass anything or to vote for anything that their law enforcement community is going to be against, because what they're worried about is when they go up for re-election in 2020, they're going to be afraid that somebody runs against them in a primary and says, I will stand by our law enforcement community instead of voting for something that they oppose. So you have to develop strategies to overcome. Now, what can they be? Well, one of the things that you're learning about the law enforcement community is they have a problem with the leaf form of the cannabis, that they believe it's so similar in nature to what is recreationally consumed. They don't like the visual of that. And what I'm seeing is that there's a little bit more receptivity among law enforcement if the cannabis were in an oil form as opposed to a leaf form. And that's not ideal as far as I'm concerned, because you can get the cannabis into your system much more effectively and efficiently if it's burned in leaf form. But one of the things that we can talk about is the oil. If this is going to be something that causes you substantial heartburn, I'm willing to sit down and listen to them in that regard. The second thing you hear from the law enforcement community is that they're afraid that a cottage industry of physicians will rise out there, and they'll be like pill mills. They'll be out there just simply giving out blank slips of paper to people to go out there and buy cannabis, and that therefore this is really a backdoor way of recreational legalization. Well, I don't think that makes a lot of sense either, because if you want to buy cannabis for recreational purposes, I doubt that you're going to go through the process of getting a medical ID card, going to a physician, getting a written authorization from a physician, and then going to a dispensary and purchasing for about 3 or 4 times what it would cost you to buy it right down at the corner. I mean, it doesn't make any sense from an economic standpoint. I'm not sure what teenager, which is what they seem to be worried about, what teenager is going to go through that matrix just to buy something that's going to cost about 3 or 4 times as much than if they just want to go down and buy it as they do now. So it doesn't make sense from an economic standpoint, but again, we're dealing with politics. We're dealing with having to overcome opposition, and again, the strategy there is, well, okay, then we'll specifically identify the conditions for which cannabis can be authorized by doctors for use by patients. We'll go ahead and specifically, as Dr. Nagarkar put up here, put the conditions that the National Academy of Sciences has stated that cannabis can be highly effective in regard to treating. And the danger there, of course, is that the more specific you are in regard to treatable conditions or conditions for which it can be authorized, the more likely you are that you're going to leave outside the legal envelope somebody who really needs it. And so I'm not advocating something that's ideal here, but what I'm talking to you is these are things and strategies that we may need to employ in order to move it forward. So the first would be the form that it's in, oil as opposed to leaf. The second would be specifically, enumerating or listing the medical conditions for which doctors can authorize it. And then the third thing would be is that law enforcement would want more of an oversight role in the growing, the processing, and the dispensing of cannabis for medicinal purposes. We've had it set up to where DHEC, which is where I think it ought to be, Department of Health and Environmental Control, that it's housed within DHEC and that DHEC has regulatory authority over the growing, processing, and dispensing. I don't see it as a law enforcement issue, but I understand that law enforcement wants more of a role in regard to oversight. So those are three areas in which law enforcement has expressed specific concerns, both the form of the cannabis, the conditions for which it can be authorized, and the oversight of the process. Those are three areas that I think that we can sit down and have a conversation with some of these lawmakers who have constituencies that are very pro-law enforcement. Now, in terms of actual votes, if we could get a bill up for a vote in the Senate right now, I think we'd get it passed by, say, a vote of, I say 30 to 16. I think we could get it passed. The problem is in the Senate that once you get a bill passed out of subcommittee, you have to have it get passed out of full committee. Then it goes on the Senate calendar. At that point in time, any senator can put their name on the bill as desiring to be present. And this is something that dates back to revolutionary days, back when legislators rode the Columbia on horseback. And if they knew that there was going to be a bill that was being debated up in Columbia, they would send a message ahead and say, put my name on that bill as desiring to be present, which means that the Senate would not debate the bill until that senator came to the chamber because the senator wanted to be heard on the matter. Well, you flash forward 200 or some odd years forward to today, day and age, you can still, as a senator, put your name on the bill as desiring to be present, and it won't be debated, and you can be sitting right there in that chamber. Okay, so what's going to happen is we'll get this bill passed at a subcommittee, and I think we'll get it passed at a full committee as well. But once it gets on that calendar, we will have a senator that puts their name on that bill desiring to be present. And the only way you can procedurally overcome that objection in the Senate is to then have the bill set for what's called special order status. And that takes a supermajority vote of the Senate to have it set for special debate. Moreover, you can't even have the matter taken up on a supermajority basis unless you have somebody who is recognized by the Lieutenant Governor who will make a motion to have it set for special order. And the way that it works in the Senate is, during the motion period, when those motions for special order are made, the Lieutenant Governor always recognizes the Senate Majority Leader. And the Senate Majority Leader, or the President Pro Tem, one of the two, they're the ones that have the ability to make the motion in regard to what should be set for special order debate. And by and large, they will make the motion based on what the majority of the caucus prefers. So in the Senate, there's 28 Republicans and 18 Democrats. So the Republicans are the majority party. So if the Republican caucus, the 28 Republican senators, want this to be something that's taken up, then it will be, a motion will be made to put up for special order debate, and then you've got to have that supermajority or 60% in order to set it for debate. So that procedurally is where we are. And so as we move through the process, the first step is subcommittee. And the subcommittee is chaired by a really good guy, Danny Verdon, from Lawrence County. And now Danny's conservative, and Danny is very strongly supportive of the law enforcement community. But Danny is also a very compassionate person, and he's somebody who wants to get medicine in the hands of people who need it. So I believe that Danny Verdon is motivated to moving a bill out of subcommittee relatively quickly into full committee. Now, is it going to contain everything that I want in it? Is it going to contain that the marijuana or the cannabis will be in leaf form as opposed to oil? Will it have all the conditions that I think ought to be included? Will it have it primarily a DHEC regulated process, or will it be SLED? I think there's probably going to have to be some give there in each respect to move it forward. But again, it's very important that we get something passed this year. It may not be the perfect bill. It probably won't be the perfect bill. In fact, I'm almost positive it won't be the perfect bill. But it's important that we start to break some eggs and make an omelet here. Okay, we need to go ahead and get this thing expanded beyond the CBD oil, expand it to more conditions, establish the sort of a framework within which individuals can come in and they can invest capital and grow facilities and start to grow the plant. And then let's set up the regulatory apparatus. And by the way, things are very sophisticated now. You can have a seed-to-sale tracking program so that in real time, when you're growing the plant, you can track where that plant is every step of the way through the time that it's then dispensed to a patient pursuant to a doctor's authorization. So this idea that there might be diversion, this idea that that it's being grown ostensibly for medical purposes, but it's actually being sold for recreational use, we have real-time software tracking. I mean, that sort of technology exists now, and that's what this bill calls for. I realize South Carolina is a very conservative state. I realize that while 78% of South Carolinians may want this available for medicinal purposes, about an equal percentage are against having it legalized for recreational purposes. That's what South Carolina is. South Carolina is a conservative state. And so I want a conservative bill. In terms of the medical marijuana bills that are in the United States, what we're going to end up with here in South Carolina is a very conservative version of that. It's going to be a tightly regulated process. It's going to have very specific conditions for which it can be authorized, and it's going to have very severe penalties for abuse. So we can get this done. As the process moves forward, Danny Verdon is the chair of the subcommittee. I serve on the subcommittee. The other three members are Brad Hutto from Orangeburg. He's a co-sponsor of the bill with me, so he's supportive. Senator Thomas Alexander, who is a senator from Oconee County, he tends to be in that camp of what I said, a very, very socially conservative senator who is going to be supportive of law enforcement's arguments. And so any of you that know Thomas Alexander, or any of you that know constituents from Oconee County, that's a vote to target initially. Another would be Senator Kevin Johnson. Senator Johnson is also, he's a Democrat, but he's also very, very concerned about cannabis. He has testified, or he said how he has seen cannabis can affect people in his community. He's worried about this being the camel's nose in the tent, that if we allow it for medicinal purposes, that's a slippery slope toward full recreational. So anybody who knows Senator Johnson also should reach out to him. And in terms of what you say, I think you start with what the people of South Carolina want, the 78% figure that I talked about. You talked about the medical research and the science and the 2007 National Academy of Sciences saying that it's highly effective. You talked about the anecdotal stories, and really this can't be stressed enough. Numbers are fine, statistics are great, but nothing beats a family being in that room and talking to their senator or the representative about what they're going through, what their child is going through, and how cannabis has made a difference. That's what got me involved in this. It wasn't from reading something online, or it wasn't from medical journals. It was from Jill Swing's mother-in-law telling me about her granddaughter, and me going to meet that granddaughter and hearing that story, and those sorts of things, that emotional connection. If you can get that, if you can go to somebody who is in opposition and demonstrate that one of your constituents can benefit directly from this, and you actually meet with him or her, you can turn that individual from an opponent to an advocate. And I've seen that happen on the Senate floor. As Jill indicated a couple years ago, I finished up the session by every morning in the Senate talking about an individual in South Carolina whose life was affected by this, who wasn't getting access to the medicine he or she needed. And oftentimes they were up in the balcony and they would be there. And then afterwards I would invite them down and have their senator meet with that family. So reach out to individuals in those communities and have them contact those individuals, and because that can make a huge difference. So I'll end with this. This is something that's going to happen sooner rather than later. It's going to happen. I mean, it just empirically makes no sense that you've got something that an overwhelming majority of the medical community now thinks to be of medicinal benefit, and you're not going to allow people to have it. I mean, that's just not going to stand. I mean, it's just not going to stand. There can be a disconnect between the law and where the people are for only so long until such time as that law just breaks down. So this is either going to happen this year or it's going to happen in 4 or 5 years. I'd rather have it happen more quickly and get something in place, get the regulatory apparatus in place, bring capital investors in here, get the grow facility started. Let's work out the kinks in the system, because I envision this as something that as we move along, we can ramp up and start more conditions being treated as the science becomes more precise. So it's important that we get started, right? I mean, it's important that we start, and I want to try for as broad a bill as possible. It's always dangerous as a politician when you start talking about compromising, because then what you do is you end up making everybody angry. You make the grassroots angry because you didn't stand by your principles and you didn't fight for what they have a right to. And on the other hand, you haven't made happy the community that didn't want it in the first place. But at some point in time, after you push as hard as you possibly can, I want to get something moved, and I want to get something passed this session. And we go in the second Tuesday in January, and we stay until the first Thursday in May, which means when we get started that very first week, I want to get a bill moved out of subcommittee and through the full committee and onto the Senate floor. So with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions that anybody might have. Yes, sir.
Well, I appreciate your work, and I agree with you 99%, okay? The thing that I'm concerned about, and Danny Burton is my senator from my district, he's told me that he just wants it, and I spoke to the Lieutenant Governor as well, he said he just wants it to be hospice only. You talk about breaking an egg, making an omelet, I agree with you, but if you don't put some cheese and bacon in, you just got scrambled eggs.
A hospice only is not acceptable. I mean, let me be clear about that. I mean, so when I'm talking about making a list of specific conditions, I'm not talking about restricting it to hospice care. Okay, I'm talking about a list of specific things like MS or cerebral palsy or chronic pain or things like that. But if that's their position, that it should only be used in hospice situations, the argument I would make is you may be being cautious for political reasons here, and you may be concerned about what the backlash would be from the law enforcement community, but there's going to be a backlash at some point in time from the 78% of South Carolinians who believe that they ought to have the right to do with their own body what they think is in their best interest in consultation with their doctor. Now that's an unassailable conservative position. And so what in reality the Lieutenant Governor and Mr. Burton are talking about there is they're not talking about individual liberty. They're not talking about limited government. They're talking about intrusive government. They're talking about government and politicians coming in and taking the place of a doctor in consultation with a patient. Okay, and that's the antithesis of a conservative position. So at some point in time, that message is going to backfire. If they're against that, then they're against what Republican Party is about. Anybody else have any questions on the political side of this? Yes, sir.
I'm actually going to talk about Burton for a second, too. Several weeks ago, he came and spoke to our group in Greenwood, attached to here Greenwood, and he did state that he would consider it for hospice only. Part of his reasons for not being in favor of it, one was he needed to see a substantial body of peer-based research, which I understand you guys have seen.
Well, you just saw Dr. Narcotti, the National Academy of Sciences, said they peer-reviewed 10,000 pieces, and they said it's highly effective. I mean, I'm not sure what more empirical data you need.
Senator Burton's seen that information as well. And on top of that, he's seen the information that has been done, research done in Israel and other places for the past 60 plus years. So that's not a viable reason not to be for it. His other reason, his biggest reason, I believe, is law enforcement. But when did law enforcement become qualified to judge what we need medically?
Well, and let me just say this, and I realize this is being taped, but I don't care. But when we have a subcommittee meeting and we've got parents with their kids who came up here to testify, and they don't have a place to sit because law enforcement throughout the state has shown up in their uniforms, taking up all the seats, something's wrong with that. Something is wrong with a system that allows individuals who are employed by the state or employed by counties and cities to come in with their uniforms on, with their guns, to intimidate. That's just wrong.
Do you think that law enforcement's opposition to it has anything at all to do with the fact that it would reduce their opportunities for asset forfeiture and marijuana seizures?
Well, that'd be a cynical position to take, wouldn't it? But, you know, the question is law enforcement position that they take on this issue driven by money? Is it driven by the fact that civil asset forfeitures, and they're allowed to sell that property and keep a majority of those proceeds outside the budgetary process? I absolutely think that has a role to play in this. And at some point in time, as I said before, there can only be a disconnect between what is right and just and what people want and what the existing status quo of the law. There can only be that disconnect for a certain amount of time. And at some point in time, there comes a rupture. And so what I would say to my conservative brothers and sisters is that this is an issue that's going to come around and bite you. Okay? Because if you're standing up there and you're preaching the gospel of limited government, you're preaching the gospel of individual liberty, you sound like a hypocrite when you then go ahead and try to take medicine out of the hands of people who need it, whose doctors are saying this will save them, and we're going to step in as politicians. That is not limited government. That's socialistic status thinking. And that's going to backfire at some point in time. You know, this is an issue that we ought to have unanimity on. I mean, you're talking about, in our country today, with we can't agree on anything, right? I mean, it seems like Republicans and Democrats, they can't agree. This ought to be something that if you're talking about empowering families and putting something in their hands that their doctors say will be medicinally beneficial, hell, if we can't find unanimity on that, we're not going to be able to find unanimity on anything. And the thing of it is this, is that, let me phrase this the right way. It's not like we're introducing the serpent into the Garden of Eden here, right? I mean, it's not that we're in a society now without cannabis. It's not like we're in a society now that doesn't have an opioid epidemic, right? I mean, we're in a situation right now where there is what President Trump called last week an opioid crisis. And that's because in many instances, doctors are prescribing opioids to patients in things that cannabis could be not only more effective, but wouldn't be as addictive. And it's just, to me, it is so hypocritical on the one hand to decry an opioid crisis, but on the other hand take this nonsensical position by saying something that is much more benign and much more effective can't be utilized. I mean, anybody can see the absurdity of that. I mean, you would think anybody could see the absurdity of that. But in any event, I'll make a prediction here. We will get a bill pass this next session, and it will be a bill more than just for hospice related. Because I just don't think that they can withstand the sort of scrutiny that's going to be brought to bear, and that I will bring to bear upon them if they do not support this. Because I'll wear them out. I will continue to call them out on this and talk in the same way I'm talking to you right now. I will go to their district and talk about it to them that way. Because this is an easy one. Right? This is one where everybody wins. I mean, we haven't even talked about the economic side of it now. I mean, think about farmers having a crop to grow, and instead of having it smuggled in from across state lines, you actually have industries here in South Carolina, entrepreneurs growing it. I mean, you can check off every single box and this is a winner. And we're going to get something passed next session, and it's not going to be just hospice only. Anything else? Yes, ma'am. Right.
Does anywhere in the bill say anything about like law enforcement regulation when it comes to
Yeah, as I said, we designed it primarily as a health-related bill, and we gave DHEC, the health department, regulatory control. And that's been one of law enforcement's pushbacks, is saying we don't have a seat at the table here. We don't have. So I think one of the things that we can talk about, and look, I want to find common ground. I'm all about compromising here if something can be moved forward that's effective. I think giving law enforcement more of an oversight role in that growing processing, dispensing process, that may be a way to overcome some of their concerns. Now, what I'm afraid of is we can respond to every single one of their concerns and they'll still oppose it. Okay, look, I mean, but you've got to deal with it as it comes. And all I can do is say, look, I want to hear what your concerns are. I want to sit down there and reason through them. You're worried about recreational diversion? We've got the seed to sale tracking program. You're worried about more involvement in the process? We'll give you a seat at the table and you can do spot checks or whatever. I mean, there are things that we can do if they're willing to negotiate in good faith. But the question is, are they? Anybody else have any questions? Yes, sir.
I know that one of the biggest hurdles is getting this bill passed, but something I foresee is going to be the next hurdle is employers in the state coming on board with this bill and allowing people who are employed in their companies, patients like myself, to not be terminated, for using this medicine if you have a doctor's recommendation. I need in this medicine, but I'll be in the same situation, if it were illegal in the state, because I can't lose my job either.
Every other question is, even if we legalize it for medicinal purposes in South Carolina, is there still going to be practical impediments because private employers have policies? And our bill addresses that to some degree. I'm going to let Jill elaborate on that.
So the bill does provide for, how do I say this? I don't think it actually provides for protections for employment, but it does provide that employers cannot discriminate against patients. Now, if the company has a policy where they do randomized drug testing, that's going to be up to those businesses to make a determination if you are a medical patient whether or not that becomes an issue. And what I would hope to see is that companies will adopt policies after it's legalized in the state so that patients are protected. There are certain circumstances under which you cannot consume cannabis and be under the influence. Operating heavy machinery, driving a school bus, all of that is pretty well outlined within the bill. And if you want to take a closer look at that, you can go to the State House website, which is www.scstatehouse.gov, and go to bill search and just enter 212. That is the Senate bill number, and then click on full text and you can read the entire portion. And the other thing is if you're a federal employee, because regardless of what our state law says, it's still federally illegal. So unfortunately at this time, pretty much in all states, federal employees use at their own risk.
What you'll also find, though, is that private companies will typically adopt rules and regulations that make their workforce more productive. And you've got enough empirical research now coming out of states that have legalized for medicinal purposes where you can see that people return to the job much more quickly after being injured and that they perform at higher levels as a consequence. So you're going to find private personnel policies being reflective of what those businesses believe make them the most productive workforce. And there's more and more empirical data out there about how this is a benefit to the workforce. So I think you're going to find the marketplace and the private sector kind of adapting as more of those studies become known. Other questions? In the shadows back there, the intern.
Regarding law enforcement, this marijuana has been approved in 29 states, so there should be evidence that supports or goes against the law enforcement position. Have they done any studies?
There is, and in fact, what you find a lot of times is that they will take either data that has been discredited, or they will take data from states that have legalized it for recreational purposes. So in other words, they don't do apples to apples comparisons. Okay, they don't go to a conservative state which has a medical policy and look at the data there. They tend to go to a state like Colorado that has legalized it very liberally for recreational purposes, and then take the data, cherry pick the data, and bring that back. But you're absolutely right. The overwhelming empirical data from states is supportive of our arguments. And so what you got to do is just break it down. You've got to ask them where they got the data from. Was it a state that was recreation as well as medical? And then you've got to look at the data. I mean, over what period of time was it collected? I mean, who's verified that data? How do we have any objective criteria assigned to it? But if you do all that, then you can discredit it. You can.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. Other questions? If not, then I'll let Jill kind of, oh, we do, I'm sorry. There, yes, ma'am.
I have a question. I heard her saying that she get educated on this medical marijuana. But my question is, and I looked at a research that shows that this state has the higher rate of people who have lower education, like college education. So I believe that medical marijuana should be able for those who need it. But my question is, how many people are going to do their job getting educated about how to use that? And my other question is that we already have an epidemic and we are not educating people to look for help. And probably the doctor knows that substance abuse is a disorder, mental disorder, and those people are not getting the help. And I know that President Obama passed an act that allows people to get mental health, and but we have the resources, but we don't have the education to look for help. And I don't know many people who may need marijuana as a medication, but I know people who, well, my brother, he was killed by a drunk driver, and he was using medication along with alcohol. And I have 3 children, and my major concern is for them to get addicted to any substance. And this state is it has a higher rate of poverty. And I know that she did her job, getting educated. But how many of these people who may get this medicine are going to do the job? And we usually don't get education and have to dispose of like medication.
One of the things, and the question about education is good. Thank you for that. One of the things that I would say is, what we're talking about here is rocket science, right? I mean, we're talking about allowing doctors, after consulting with a patient, to decide what's in that patient's best medical interest. I mean, so the level of the inquiry here, in terms of people's ability to grasp it, or people's ability to say, yes, that's the right thing, I think it's pretty fundamental. We're talking about something here that people get at a very instinctive level, which is why 78% of South Carolinians favor this. Now, education does come in. I have found that younger physicians, or MDs, tend to be more receptive to this than older physicians, because they're learning more about the medicinal benefits of cannabinoids in medical school now, whereas somebody who's 40 or older perhaps didn't learn it in medical school. So you've got an education issue there in regard to physicians, and in regard to physicians suggesting this as a medicinal approach for patients. So there is an educational component involved here. But in terms of just the threshold thing of should this be something that doctors should be authorized if they think it's in the patient's best interest? Most people get that very instinctively. And I guess the question becomes, if you're somebody suffering, you know, like Jill's daughter was, how do you then become aware that maybe cannabis is something that might help you, right? And I think that may be what you're getting at in terms of education. How will people realize that if they've got neurological problems or autoimmune diseases or chronic pain, how will they become aware that this is something that is available to them? And I think that's a combination of doctors being educated and, quite frankly, the community as a whole, you know, becoming more aware of what the medicinal benefits are. So education takes time. There's no one specific thing you can do. The best you can do is sort of talk about it like we are today. Okay, and that
So, Senator Davis did mention that we have an opioid crisis. And South Carolina Compassionate Care Alliance is an affiliate with ASA, Americans for Safe Access, which is a national organization based out of Washington, D.C. They do a tremendous amount of advocacy work on Capitol Hill, working on federal bills that have anything to do with cannabis, but their goal is the same as our goal, which is to bring medicine that is safe and regulated into the hands of patients. And one of their focuses right now is the opioid crisis, because it is a crisis. And they launched a campaign on November 1st, End Pain, Not Lives, Make Cannabis an Option. And many of the patients around the state of South Carolina have participated in our version, or our portion, our contribution to that campaign in the form of a slideshow that I would like to end today by sharing with all of you.
You're broken down and tired of living life on the merry-go-round, and you can't find a fighter, but I see it in you, so we gon' walk it out. Ooh, mountains, we gon' walk it out, and mountains. And I rise like the day. I rise unafraid. I rise up, and I do it 1,000 times again. And I rise up, I like the waves. I rise up, in spite of the age. I rise up, and I do it 1,000 times again. The silence isn't quiet, and it feels like it's getting hard to breathe. And I know you feel like dying, but I promise we'll take no retreat. Ooh, mountains, bring it to its feet. Ooh, mountains, and I rise like the day. I rise up, I rise unafraid. I rise up. together, and for that we have each other. And we will rise, we will rise, we will rise. I'll rise up, rise like the day. I'll rise up in spite of the ache. I will rise 1,000 times again, and we'll rise up. I like the waves. We'll rise up in spite of the ache. We'll rise up, and we'll do it 1,000 times again.
Please join me in thanking our participants for their courage and their commitment. Will you be able to stick around for questions afterward? Sure. Good. Thank you all for coming out.